There are decisions you can make without anyone's permission, yet somehow you still find yourself waiting for it. Nobody has told you that you cannot leave the job, move somewhere new, say no to the request, change your mind, or start the thing you have been thinking about for years. You are an adult, so technically the decision belongs to you. But still, before you make a decision, you look outward, as though somewhere outside yourself there is a person whose approval would finally make the choice feel safe. Maybe you ask someone what they would do. Then you ask someone else, because the first answer didn't quite settle you. You search for advice, read another article, think through every possible consequence, and tell yourself that you are simply being careful. Sometimes you genuinely are, but sometimes, underneath all that consideration, there is a quieter question you haven't quite admitted you are asking. Am I allowed to do this? That question can hide remarkably well because it doesn't always sound like dependence. It can sound like responsibility. It can look like kindness, humility, thoughtfulness, or a healthy desire to consider the people around you. There is nothing wrong with any of those things. In fact, being able to listen, compromise, accept advice, and recognize how your decisions affect other people is part of becoming an emotionally mature adult. The problem begins when considering another person's opinion quietly becomes giving that person the final vote. You might notice it in small decisions first. For instance, you want to wear something different, but you imagine how someone might react. You want to say no, but before the word even reaches your mouth, you're already preparing an explanation that will make your refusal easier for the other person to accept. Or you have an idea for your career, a business, a move, a relationship, or simply a different way of living, yet you keep waiting for the moment when someone you respect will look at you and say, "Yes, that makes sense. You should do it." And the strange part is that sometimes nobody is actually holding you back. There is no locked door. There is no official authority standing in front of you. Nobody has necessarily said no. You have simply become accustomed to looking around before moving forward, as though life requires a signature from someone else before you can put your name on it. So who are you waiting for? Your parents? A partner? A boss? Your friends? Your family? Society? Or perhaps some imagined version of the person you think you are supposed to become? The responsible one. The sensible one. The person who never disappoints anybody and never makes a choice that causes someone else to question them? The answer is rarely simple, because the waiting itself has deeper roots than the present moment. Most of us learned early that movement required approval. As children, we needed permission for nearly everything that mattered. Permission to leave the table, to speak, to try something new, or even to feel certain emotions out loud. Those early lessons were not always delivered with harshness. They often arrived wrapped in care, in structure, in the ordinary rules that keep a household or a classroom running. Yet through repetition, the nervous system learned more than the rules themselves. It learned to associate someone else's approval with feeling settled. The nervous system is constantly taking in information from what happens around us. It notices things like words, tone of voice, facial expressions, and changes in the situation, and the brain helps interpret what those signals mean. From there, the body can respond accordingly. Most of this happens automatically. We do not have to consciously analyze every signal before our bodies respond to it. You can see this in something as ordinary as a child asking for permission. When a child asks, "Can I go outside?" and hears yes, their nervous system receives several signals at once. The word yes, the calm or positive tone, and the open, approving expression. The brain interprets these signals together. I am allowed to go ahead. Then the body softens a little and the child runs out to play. When this happens again and again, the brain begins to associate that external approval with the feeling of being settled enough to move forward. Now imagine the same child asks, "Can I have another cookie?" And the parent says, "No," in a firm voice, looks serious, or does not answer clearly. Again, The nervous system receives information, the word no, the firmer tone, the serious expression, or the absence of a clear yes. The brain interprets those signals differently. I should not go ahead yet. And the body responds to that interpretation. The child pauses, pays closer attention, waits, or becomes a little more cautious about what happens next. None of this requires the child to consciously analyze the situation. The nervous system simply receives the signals. The brain helps make sense of them, and the body responds. And when experiences like these happen repeatedly, for instance, when asking to speak, to leave the table, to try something new, the same pattern keeps being reinforced. Uncertainty means the child should check, while someone else's response tells the child whether to move forward, stop, or wait. That is the pattern we eventually carry into adulthood. Except adulthood changes the circumstances. The people who once told us when we could move, speak, choose, or proceed are no longer standing beside us in the same way. Parents may be distant or gone, while teachers no longer hold authority over our days, yet the blueprint they helped shape remains, quietly influencing how we respond to choices in the present. But why does it remain when the circumstances have changed? Why doesn't the brain simply recognize that we are adults now and replace the old pattern with a new one? Because the brain is built to work efficiently, and it does so by reusing repeated patterns rather than creating a new response from scratch each time. As those patterns are repeated, they also become familiar to the brain, making them easier to recognize and return to when a similar situation arises. This is why the hesitation can feel so familiar and so hard to argue with. You stand in front of a choice that is fully yours, leaving a job that no longer fits, saying no to a request that drains you, beginning something you have only imagined, or simply living in a way that differs from what others expected, and the old pattern still activates. The mind begins searching for someone whose opinion might settle the uncertainty. You ask, you research, you weigh every angle, and somewhere underneath the practical considerations sits the quieter hope that a clear external yes will finally make the path feel safe enough to take. What began as a useful way of navigating childhood becomes, in adult life, a subtle delay. The nervous system is still oriented toward an earlier pattern, one that depended on the responses of people who were larger and more powerful than we were. It does not easily recognize that the adult self now holds the capacity to decide, to adjust, and to live with the ordinary consequences of those decisions. So the scanning continues, the waiting continues, and the life that could be moving forward remains, in small and large ways, suspended until an approval arrives that may never come in the form we are looking for. This same pattern often shows up as people-pleasing. Because the nervous system learned that approval helps create a sense of settledness, it becomes skilled at anticipating what will keep that approval intact. And gradually, that can begin to shape the way you express what you want. You soften a preference before saying it. You explain a boundary before anyone has questioned it. You even postpone a desire until you have enough reassurance from other people to feel comfortable pursuing it. On the surface, this can look like kindness or maturity. Underneath, it is frequently the old association still at work. If I can secure the yes, or at least avoid the no, then I can feel steady enough to proceed. And that is where an old pattern can quietly become a limitation. Because decisions that could have shaped a different path remain in the realm of almost, and relationships may stay smoother than they are honest. And perhaps the deepest cost of living this way is that, over time, the habit of checking with other people can make it difficult to hear your own judgment clearly. When every important decision passes through the question of how it will be received, your attention gradually shifts from understanding what you want to managing how other people will respond to it. Over time, a low sense of restlessness can settle in, the feeling of living inside a life that is functional, perhaps even successful by some measures, yet not fully authored by the person living it. Functional can be a strange place to live. Nothing may be obviously wrong, yet something still feels incomplete. The life works on paper. Responsibilities are being handled, relationships are being maintained, and the necessary decisions are getting made. But somewhere beneath that functioning is the awareness that many of those decisions were made by adapting to what was expected rather than by asking what actually felt right. That does not mean every part of the life is unwanted, or that every compromise was a mistake. It means that when the habit of seeking approval becomes strong enough, a person can become very good at building a life that works for everyone around them while becoming less certain that it works for them. And the longer this continues, the harder it can become to separate what you genuinely want from what you have learned to want. Other people's expectations can become so internalized that you start treating them as your own preferences. What once sounded like, "What will they think?" can eventually become something much quieter. "This is just what I want." The expectation is no longer experienced as coming from outside you because you have become so accustomed to shaping yourself around it. This is why the problem can remain invisible for so long. There may be no dramatic moment when a person realizes they have handed over their choices. Instead, there is a gradual narrowing of what feels possible, followed by an equally gradual acceptance of that narrower life as simply the way things are. So how do you begin changing a pattern that has been operating automatically for years? Not by suddenly deciding that you will never ask anyone for advice again. That would simply replace one extreme with another. The goal is not to stop listening to people. It is to change the point at which their opinions enter the decision. Instead of asking for approval before you know what you think, begin by giving yourself the opportunity to form your own position first. Sit with the decision long enough to separate your actual preference from the reactions you are already imagining. Ask yourself what you would choose if you knew nobody would be disappointed, impressed, worried, or pleased by the answer. Not because other people do not matter, but because their reactions are not the same thing as your judgment. Then, if you want advice, seek it after you have identified your own position. This creates an important difference. You are no longer asking another person to tell you what you should want. You are asking them to help you examine something you have already thought about. Their perspective can add information without automatically replacing your own. Do that often enough, and the brain begins to encounter a different pattern. Instead of automatically moving from uncertainty to external approval, it begins to experience uncertainty followed by your own judgment, followed by action. At first, that may not feel particularly natural. The old urge to check with someone may still appear because familiar patterns do not disappear simply because you understand them. But each time you make room for your own judgment before seeking reassurance, you give the brain new information about how decisions can be made. Over time, this can make the process feel less foreign. You begin to discover that you can listen to someone else's opinion without immediately handing them the decision. You can consider what they say, disagree with parts of it, change your mind if something genuinely changes your thinking, or keep your original position when it still makes sense. Their response becomes information rather than permission. And that distinction is important because the goal was never to become someone who does not care what other people think. The goal is to stop confusing their approval with evidence that you are making the right choice. There will still be moments when you hesitate. There will still be decisions where you genuinely need advice, and there will still be people whose opinions matter deeply to you. Changing this pattern does not mean eliminating those relationships or pretending that every decision can be made alone. It means becoming able to hear another person's perspective without losing contact with your own. Eventually, the question can begin to change. Instead of automatically asking, "Is this okay with them?" you can first ask, "What do I actually think?" Then you can consider what others think without allowing their answer to determine whether your own judgment is legitimate. That is how the pattern begins to change. Not through one dramatic act of confidence, but through repeated experiences of making room for your own judgment and discovering that you can live with the uncertainty that follows. Because perhaps what you have been waiting for all this time is not really someone else's permission. Perhaps you have been waiting for the feeling that you are finally allowed to trust yourself.